Oh, hi, everybody. Welcome to episode number 76 of Circle of Fellows. This is a monthly conversation among a group of IEBC fellows, topics of interest to communicators. And we have a topic, I think, of interest to a lot of communicators today, certainly one that has been of interest to me for a long time. And we have a terrific panel to talk about organizational culture and the impact that communicators can have on culture. You who are watching live are welcome and even encouraged to submit questions, share your questions, share your observations and experiences using the chat feature on YouTube. And we'll be able to see those on the screen and present them to everybody else watching, and the panel will address them. So, please be part of this conversation with your questions and your observations. Want to go around the horn here and have the panelists introduce themselves. I'll start since I realize I didn't do that. I'm Shel Holtz. I will be moderating the panel. I am Senior Director of Communications at WebCore, which is a general contractor and builder headquartered in San Francisco, and I'm in Concord, California in the East Bay. And as I see everybody on the screen, Lety, you're next.
Hi, how everybody. I'm Lety Narvaez. I'm based in Mexico City, and I have been working in communications for more than 30 years, and I have an agency here delivering consultancy on strategic communications, corporate reputation, and a lot of training also on communication. Great to see you.
Martha?
Hi there. My name is Martha Muzychka. I'm based in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador, Canada. And I work in communications strategy, and I also do a lot of facilitation and training in communications, writing, and presenting. A lot of my work is in the not-for-profit sector, but I also do work with corporate and various institutions. I love the variety in my practice. It allows me to meet a lot of really cool people doing interesting things. And it's also one of the reasons why I like being a member of IEBC, because I get to participate in panels like this one, also full of cool and interesting people.
Oh, nice to be thought of that way. Alice, you're up next.
Okay, I'm going to apologize now for the background noise. The neighborhood landscapers are outside my window, so I'll be on mute a lot of the time. But I'm a communications consultant based in Houston. I primarily work in the energy industry, helping businesses take their business strategies and translate those into clear and compelling messages.
Wonderful. And Mark, you're last but not least.
Hey there, I'm Mark Schumann, also calling in today from Houston, Texas. I've been a professional communicator, I just figured out, since Jimmy Carter was president, and worked for several years in recent years as the head of culture for a tech company in Texas. So today's topic is of a lot of interest. Right now, I do a lot of coaching, and I'm working with the CHRO program at the Wharton Business School.
Wonderful. Thanks, everybody, for the introductions. And I think it probably makes sense to define what we're talking about before we talk about it. Culture is a big word. My favorite definition of culture has always been a very simple one, the way things are done around here. But I'm curious about the definitions that you apply when you're working in the world of organizational culture. How do you define it? Mark, since you were the vice president of culture at that organization, I think it would be appropriate for you to kick this off.
Well, I laughed. I think that we all should now and then in our careers kind of push ourselves into something that we know will be uncomfortable. And it stretches us, and it helps us kind of clarify what we're all about. And I found working inside a company with a pure focus on culture every day was an incredible experience. I wouldn't trade it for anything. But I did reach the point, Shel, where I defined culture as all the things that we tolerate. And my reason for that is there is such impact on culture that comes from the top, and the behavior that we see, the behavior that we may or not realize we follow, and the behavior that the organization lets people get away with. And that becomes an ultimate trap that can inhibit all the positive things that well-intentioned people want to do with culture. So that's my counter definition for the morning.
I like it. In fact, I'll probably carry that back to my employers and suggest that we consider that as we talk about culture, which we do a lot. Anybody else want to weigh in on how you define culture?
I think that when we think about culture, we tend to not make the distinction between the culture that we actually have and the culture we aspire to. We tend to define our culture as the one we aspire to, when in reality, we often are far from that in what we actually are doing in a company.
Yeah, Alice, I love that, because I think that in fact that becomes a key role that we can play, because we bring as communicators these strengths of being able to find truth and share truth, and there isn't a topic that organizations face that requires truth more than the discussion of culture. So I love that. Love that.
I want to sort of start the conversation with a study that I have been pointing to for some time. This was a study that was conducted back in 2016. It's from the Workforce Institute at Kronos and Workplace Trends. It's titled, "Who's the Boss of Workplace Culture?" And it found that 1/3 of HR professionals said that the head of HR defines the culture. Only 10% of managers and 3% of employees agreed with that. 20% of managers said the executive team defines the workplace culture. 29% of employees said it was employees who define workplace culture, and 28% of employees feel that no one defines workplace culture. Only 5% of HR professionals and 7% of managers agreed with that. So there is no consistent agreement around who defines workplace culture. And here we are getting ready to talk about how communicators can influence the culture. Who does define the workplace culture? Is it accurate, those 28% of employees who say nobody does?
I think it is kind of accurate in reverse. Everybody does. So if everybody does, nobody feels responsible for it. I think that the workplace culture, when we talk about that it's defined by the things we tolerate, who are the people who are tolerating those things? It's your managers and the people above them. And you know, if a behavior that's really not positive gets reinforced going up the chain, then that becomes an accepted part of the culture. Whereas if things that are people who are heroes are recognized for positive things as heroes, then that becomes part of the culture.
And I could have like a little bit of a conflict with the word defines. I think that everybody lives the culture more than defines it. So I think that everybody who lives within the company live this culture. Nobody defines it exactly. And I think that is, the culture is more like the way that everybody lives the environment and the communication and the relationship, how they interact with everybody, with the employer and among all the employees. So I believe that's the culture, and everybody participates in developing and evolving this culture.
Yeah, I was once in a discussion, Letty, and they were talking about culture is this and culture this. And I said, why don't we talk about this without using the word? And what would we talk about if we don't use the word? Because I think sometimes using the word becomes its own trap. And I just had to smile, Shell, at the question, because, you know, in the danger signals that we hear, when a CEO says, I want to change the culture, you know, the alarm should go off. When the head of HR says, I own the culture, 2 alarms should go off. I mean, this is where I think that I always love to think about what makes a culture trauma-proof, and it's usually keeping a culture safe from the trauma that we create inside when different people say, I own this or I'm in charge of this, because the reality is everybody owns it. And it's just what you described, Letty. It is what life is.
If everybody owns it, should somebody be responsible for ensuring that it moves in the right direction? I mean, the company you work for, Mark, hired somebody to do just that, right?
I think, when I reflect on that wonderful experience, I felt the most value I played was as kind of the culture conscience. And to say, we're having an anti-cultural moment and where we're doing something that isn't who we are. And there is that balance, Alice, of saying who we are versus who we want to be. And when we get trapped in kind of the vortex in between. And I do think, and I think this is where the skills we bring as communicators, especially the skill we bring to listen to people, becomes the most valuable in kind of playing that conscience role, to know what to listen for, and then to know how to share it with those who can make a difference in the behavior they model.
Yes. And building on what you just mentioned, Mark, it's on listening to people, and I think that's one of the main roles of all of us as communicators.
Yeah.
Listening to what they have to say, to what they live, to what they expect from the company. So I think that's one of the main roles of the communicator now.
One of the things I've learned in working with some natural resource companies, because of their focus on safety and looking after workplace health and occupational issues, how that's translated into not just around safe practices, avoiding slips and falls or operating machinery safely, but how they treat each other so that people feel they can belong and bring their whole self to that space. And I think there's a lot we can learn from safety communications that contribute to that transition from who we are now to who we'd like to be.
Yeah. And I think you do need to have this picture of who you want to be, because it gives you hope and it gives you a reason to think things can be better. But I love what you say, Martha, because when we were looking at how will our people feel at home here? And we would ask people, how will you feel at home here? And so much of it was that I feel that someone else is watching out for me, that I can rely on other people. I do my best work because I don't want to let my coworkers down. And the relationships between each other were at the top of the list of things that defined this as a place I call home, and a place I feel welcome. And that gave us a lot to know what we could, where we could move within that.
I think
Martha,
we've also.
I think it's interesting that you raised safety as sort of a touch point for culture. I work in construction, which is one of the most dangerous industries out there. And where I work, we have this mantra that we keep repeating about speak up for safety, because the culture, not just at our company, but in the industry, it's, I think, 81 or 89% male. It's type A, so people have grit, right? And they power through. And if they're, we're going to make that schedule, regardless of the fact that it involves this person doing something dangerous, and I'm not going to say anything because, man, I'm a tough guy. That's a hard culture to change. So I think safety is, companies that are focused on that have a real challenge on their hands, changing some very ingrained behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it starts with modifying and modeling positive practices. I mean, I did work on vision health, looking after eyes. And, people would say the older the worker, the harder it was to get them to use safety glasses or ear protection. And when they looked at their younger population, it wasn't that difficult because they were already used to wearing helmets when they were ice skating, or they wore mouth guards, or they had gone to shop classes where you had to wear safety glasses. So the practice had already started. So seeing good cultural practices, good safety practices is really critical. Also, I think understanding how microaggressions can undermine your efforts. I do a lot of work in gender equity, also in the resource sector. And I remember the light bulb moment in talking to the VP on human resources, and they're all engineers, they're all competent, excellent professionals. And I said, if I'm on an oil rig and I'm constantly surrounded by, jokes, inappropriate images, uh, uh, bad language, if you will, in terms of describing people, I said, what makes you think I'll be confident that people will have my back when I'm on the rig, if we're all in this together, when outside of that environment you treat me with such disrespect? And that whole thing around trust, it suddenly made sense to them. And that was what we used to start talking about safety and respect and dignity in the workplace is all part of a workplace culture.
One of the questions that was shared in advance of this was, how do we define a healthy culture in today's world? Before we ask that question, though, how do you define your current culture in an organization? How would you go about assessing and defining? You can't fix what you can't measure, we often say. How do you put some concrete metrics or definitions around the existing culture in your organization?
Well, we certainly invested in research, and I use the term research specifically, and I'm not usually a big fan of engagement surveys because I don't know what we learn from them, but research into the relationship people have with the organization and with each other and with their managers and with their leaders, the fundamental relationship, the fundamental what holds people together based on how they define culture, not how leaders define it, not how HR defines it, but how people define it, gives you a solid foundation from which to enhance the experience. And so I think the investment in research for us was paramount, because it set up how we then listen to people on an ongoing basis. It gave us the foundation from which to measure. And then the big test was when we got into COVID. It really helped us define the guardrails that we could maneuver within as we had to overnight change how people worked. And so I think that using our research skills to truly understand what this work means to me, what this job means to me, what these people mean to me, so we're working within that truth, that really tells us everything I think we need to know.
And I believe there are many different ways in which we can measure these different surveys, kinds of surveys. Something I believe it's quite important is like to know and to identify how can we contribute to build a high development culture, and to be aware that today's workers care less about job satisfaction and more about personal growth. The workplace is changing very fast. Digital technology has changed the way employees interact with each other and their employer. So this has scrambled the traditional worker-manager relationship and has reshaped how employers and employees see each other. So we must be aware that employees want purpose and meaning from their work. They want to be known for what makes them unique, and want relationships, particularly with a manager who can coach them to the next level. So in this area, I believe that it's very important for us to know some elements for employee engagement, because that's something that we must, as communicators, contribute to foster every time.
I think one of the things that we haven't exactly said, but that's been underlying a lot of the comments, is the fact that the culture that we aspire to has to be built from the strengths of the culture that we have now. And so it's like makeup, you take your best assets and enhance them. And it's a process of understanding those assets by doing the research and talking to people and finding the stories that are told and retold throughout the organization. And that's when you begin to hear, oh, this is what this organization is about. I was in an organization once where sometime in the past at an employee meeting, an employee had stood up and asked a question, and the CEO had said, "That's a stupid question." And years later, no one would ask questions in a meeting. In fact, all questions had to be asked on a card because nobody wanted to do that again. And it only happened once. But that was a story that was told. Everybody knew that it had happened.
Yeah. And it's fascinating because in some ways, culture is like this great big piece of adhesive tape that saves every memory that people have. And those stories are told forever, both the positive and the negative. And I think that only when we ask people what the foundations of this culture are and what we want to hang on to, and what we want to get rid of, can we really look to what that new place can be. I do think it's a little bit dangerous when a new CEO comes in and on day one says, "I'm going to change the culture." Sorry, it doesn't work that way. You can change yourself. You can certainly change, and it begins with how you work with your own immediate team. I always say, show me an unhealthy culture, and let's look at the leadership team and how they don't work together, and usually you find it. And so I think that part of the role that we play is to be, maybe we're culture realists, and we help people see what really can be done and what really needs to be done.
I also think it's how you use your values, and do you practice them and use them to guide your policy and your work ethic and how you treat each other. I mean, if we talk about respect as a value, and people are all about respecting the environment or respecting the community, and yet there's not a whole lot of respect going around the meeting table, where people aren't heard or people are shut down for the questions they ask, then that disconnect between what the values are on the wall and what you actually do, I think there's a role for communicators to bring people into that conversation, and not to call them out and make a show of them, but to say, there's a disconnect here, and this is how it's affecting how we work as a company. How can we change for the better? And if you do come in and someone says, we're going to change all the culture, that in itself is disrespectful, because while there may be flaws, we're not perfect. No one has a perfect culture. Assuming that everything that's there is bad is not a good place to start from.
Yes, I completely agree with what Marta said. That's why I believe we need to ask ourselves if the companies really walk the talk when it comes to culture, and what is the role of communication strategy in this matter. Official corporate values only matter to the extent that they shape employees' activities and decisions on a day-to-day basis. So aligning the behavior with official culture allows companies to differentiate themselves from competitors, build trust in stakeholders, increase brand equity, and attract great talent.
And I think I love the discussion of values, because I think one of the questions that we can ask, and I think as communicators, we get to ask questions, and I think we're pretty good at asking questions. But I think one of the questions is, where did your values come from? And I know that the minute I hear the executive say, well, we went to the mountains and had a retreat, I start to shiver, because those sound great for values that are painted on a wall. I did believe, and I think it was useful when we went about wanting to redefine, or we didn't know if we wanted to redefine, but we wanted to really take a close look at if the values expressed were true to our people. We asked the people, and we asked the people, what do you bring to work, and what do you look for in each other? And the values that they identified were a whole lot different than the ones that had been delivered by Values R Us. And so I think that when we involve people and again use our skills to facilitate these kinds of conversations, what we get is so rich and much richer than anyone can find in a retreat.
One of the things that we did where I work, we held a series of meetings called culture conversations. We first put out a call to action to find employees who wanted to be facilitators and put them through a day of facilitation training.
That's wonderful.
That included, the actual sessions they'd be facilitating. And then we had them record the responses they got. One of the things that came out of that was a word cloud. What were the words that kept coming up? And, just the way people perceived the culture was so crystal clear in the word cloud.
As you know, Shel, we did what we called the Culture Club in an homage to Boy George, but it was a series of monthly discussions that it ultimately reached about 10% of our population around the world participated in these monthly conversations. And these conversations were word culture was never used beyond the title of the club. It was all about what's happening at work today, what scares me, what excites me, what disappoints me, so that we could provide very just in the moment feedback to our senior leaders, our managers about what was happening in the work environment today. It was an incredible experience as someone, as we all have spent a career listening to people. It was especially useful, however, because it enabled us to be in the moment. And this is, if I learned one thing, it was that culture work is the most relevant when it is in the moment. And for us, it happened to be that we were having these, around the world discussions, because it took about 3 weeks every month during the period when COVID started to take over the world. And literally every day we had like a more intense conversation with someone in a different part of the world about what this thing we don't understand could mean to us. And I kind of felt like we were like right there as people were starting to form their views. And when we can be there in the moment, that's when we really are providing value that matters.
What's interesting is we haven't talked at all about any communications that we issue in this process. We're talking about our role as communication strategists and as people who facilitate the communication that goes on, rather than as people who are, writing the newsletter about the values and the culture. And I think that that's a really important shift in our roles.
Well, does that mean that there shouldn't be any communication going out that addresses this?
No, I think our role to reinforce and to use our traditional tools to reinforce is huge. I think that I go back to, I was really lucky to get to be a part of the early years of Southwest Airlines. And one of the most important steps they took was to put all these pictures like we would in a house of the family having celebrations together. And so every place you were in the organization, it was reinforced what it means to all be together. So I think our role, maybe Alice, I think you raised a really interesting point. Maybe we have an important bookend. We're so essential at the front to listen, and we're equally important at the other end to reinforce what's actually happening, and then we help facilitate what happens in the middle. I don't know.
Before we go on, I just want to remind everybody who's watching live as we hit the halfway point that you are welcome and encouraged to ask questions, share observations, make points, tell us your experiences. Just use the chat function in YouTube and we'll present those to the panel. So the question was, what does a healthy culture look like in today's world?
Oh, was it?
Yeah, well, it's one that I said I was going to pose, and now I'm posing it.
So Shel, and I think the key words in that question were today's world, because as we've all experienced, today's world is a whole lot different than if we had this conversation 2 years ago. And I think right now, if I was going to say what is a healthy culture in today's world, it's where I can go and be a total mess. I think that we have to recognize what people have been through. We have to recognize that we have had to maneuver this informal formal balancing act between working from home or working wherever or having to go to work or whatever. And I think right now, I'm going to just say that I think a root cause of what we call the Great Resignation is my life's a mess, my work is a mess, and I want to go where it's not messy. And so I'm going to go somewhere else where it's not messy. So we were laughing. I was with a bunch of HR people yesterday, and I said, okay, who tolerates mess better than anybody else? Because I think right now the organization that lets me be uncertain, the organization that lets me kind of, I don't know what I'm thinking, I want to figure it out. Maybe if you let me experiment and do this kind of job here and this kind of job there, the organization that lets me be, and the week boils it down to the organization that lets me be messy, that's the culture I want to work in today. One that doesn't expect me to have it all figured out.
And I believe like part of a healthy culture is also we as communicators promoting that alignment between what is being said and done. And part of this is helping training leaders to really act according to what is expected, to satisfy these expectations of uncertainty of the employees and help them know how to communicate with all the employees. So training leaders on how to communicate and how to engage their collaborators, their employees, I believe it's fundamental.
We talked about, Martha, establishing a culture of safety. IBM, if you go back and read the literature on their history, they were once famous for a culture of managing. I've also heard reference to a culture of recognition. There are all these different cultures that organizations aspire to, but it seems to me that they're just pieces of the puzzle. As communicators, how can we help an organization where, for example, the leaders say, we want to build a culture of coaching in the management team as opposed to bossing, while maintaining the bigger picture in terms of what the overarching culture is like?
I think you have those conversations. And I look to my child's grade school at the beginning of the year, the students would say, the teacher would ask, how would you like this classroom to be a friendly place, a helpful place for you to learn? And the kids collaborated and came up with their own rules, if you will, their own practices and how that would happen. You know, asking before you borrowed something, being kind to each other, not, listening to when people were feeling or showing signs that they were sad. And so I think if you're looking at how people want to be coached, I mean, earlier, I think it was Mark that said, have the conversations with the people at the front line. And what is it that you see and what is it that you need? I read a piece of research from a couple of months ago that was in July, where they surveyed workers about return to offices as a place to work, and not a whole lot of enthusiasm. It was around 50-50. But when they started looking at the data from Black people's perspective, from women's perspective, the gap was quite significant in how few Black people and how few women wanted to return to the workspace. And I think that contained really useful information for people to say what's happening where people actually don't want to go back to that form of working. And, so asking someone how they like to learn or how they would like to be supported in this beautiful, messy, creative, very uncertain, and perhaps for some people, somewhat anxious making environment is the place to start.
We had just before COVID, we had in one of our culture club discussions an exercise, and I just love, Martha, the way you described that. We did an exercise kind of like that because it was the start of a new year of 2020, a year we thought would be calm. And we declared as the result of those conversations, we wanted to be the most welcoming organization in our industry, which is a big aspiration. But what was fascinating were all the different ways that people defined welcoming. And what I loved about the conversations is that we got all the elephants in the room and we talked about all of the things that can be challenging for organizations to confront. And it was so healthy. And it helped me realize that back to the first question, Shell, of what defines culture, culture is truly in the eye of the beholder. And how we define it is going to be very different. But I love that aspiration to be welcoming, because that felt like it was something then that gave us a sense of purpose.
In the moment, Mark, you were talking about the whole idea of defining culture as it exists in the world today. Organizations have established cultures, whether intentionally or not, in a world where most people came to the office. There were significant efforts to retain culture when people were sent home and working remotely. I'm not sure that was the best idea, to try to retain a culture that was based on everybody being in the same place. Now we're going to a hybrid in a lot of places. I know where I work, it's going to be most employees required to be on site 3 days, can work remote 2 days per week. It seems to me, especially when, and challenge me on this if you disagree, one thing that I hear a lot and agree with to a great extent is that culture is built on shared experience. The experience is different. Should the culture be different? Should we be looking to establish some parameters or to define a culture based on a hybrid model of coming into the office and staying at home?
That's a real challenge, partly because in your situation, for example, it's a construction company. There is a large percentage of your employee base that doesn't get to pick. You can't do the construction from home.
Can't build a building from home. You cannot.
And so we always have to remember, when we're talking about culture, all the different components of the audience and how what we're talking about affects them. When, if we put too much emphasis on the hybrid environment and how that's what kind of company we are now, a lot of people are going to feel disenfranchised by that. Yeah. And so it's a challenge. I'm not saying I have an answer. I'm just saying, it's harder than it looks.
Yeah, I think that it brings to the front a challenge we've always had. First of all, culture is an outcome. And so if we look at what creates the outcome, there's always been a transactional component. I get my job done and I have the tools to do my job, and an emotional component, which is all about how connected I feel. What has happened in the world has changed for many people, both of these. And so addressing the transactional and, here's what it takes to get the job done, that's the simple part. But I think we only can address the emotional component if we've done the research to know what matters. And so the guidance I've given to organizations in the past few months is find what matters to people and what relationships matter to people, and then figure out the channels in order to facilitate the conversations. Because what matters is the conversation. Whether it's in person, around a water cooler, at a picnic, or on a Zoom, is maybe less of an issue to people than the access to each other.
So one of the things I'm thinking is we're talking about how we have to listen and understand what the culture is and what people want, and but let's talk a little bit. I'm thinking we're not talking about the process of going from here to there. How do we get leaders engaged in this process? And this assumes that we have enough of a voice ourselves to be listened to.
Yeah, that voice raises an interesting question, Alice. We're in a situation right now where employers are desperate for workers. there's just a shortage of workers out there. It's leading to a number of tactics. You're seeing employers raising wages on low wage work. You're seeing all kinds of concessions and benefits being thrown at people. You're seeing employers go out to their retirees and say, want to come back? All kinds of different approaches. But based on the idea that people want to work in a great culture, people want to work in an organization with a purpose that they can believe in, how important is it for employees to share that voice externally in order to convey the culture that we have? And how do we present the culture externally so that people will say, that's where I want to go work?
I think people have to recognize that culture is not a uniform cookie cutter result. I mean, when we look at cultures, when we look at the discussions around post-COVID, post-pandemic, do we have hybrid offices? Do we return to offices? The initial tone of the discussion was we go back to the way we were before. And, I think we need to look at what we've learned from the pandemic to say some people don't function well in that environment, and some people are thriving in a work from home environment. Some people like the idea of a couple of days here and a couple of days there. A culture that reflects the uniqueness and diversity of shared experiences, but while they may be shared, they're also unique to the person. That lovely, again, to return to Mark's beautiful concept of the messiness of a culture that allows for diversity and not an adherence to a code of uniformity. And I think that's, for me, where I'm looking at the conversations around culture is it's not just the one person or the one type of person or the one type of value. It's how do we build something from a common group of people that share a vision, in this case, the company's vision or a community's vision, and how can we best achieve it? And talk about the ways as opposed to the way. I mean, as much as I like The Mandalorian, it's not always about this is the way.
Yeah.
Right? There's multiple routes, and we need to look at the beauty of all those different channels and all those different tools that we have.
That is so beautifully said, Martha. And when we go back to this look of culture is what we tolerate, that there's a real upside to that, and that is that we have for years hoped that work environments could become less formal. Well, we got that overnight. The minute that I started Zooming from my kitchen and people could see what I put on the refrigerator door, work became less formal. The minute that my dog barks, work became less formal. One of my favorite moments was when our CEO was delivering a very important address to the world, thousands of people on there. And there's a knock at his study door, and it's his son saying, "Dad, can I print out my science paper?" And you could feel this rush of reaction of, he only has one printer. He's human. and so all of a sudden we're less formal. We stripped the kind of the stuff away, and so that means we tolerate more, and that's really exciting. To the fact that now, Martha, we can welcome mess and we can welcome real life. And I was with somebody yesterday who thought we needed to have a policy for what you put in your Zoom background. And I said,
No.
Why? Why? You're going to tell me I can't have my calendar or my grandchild's artwork on my fridge? I mean, come on. And so I think that we can, this is where our skills, and I think you had a really important point, Alice, about the discussion of our skills versus our product. And our skills are to find the words to sometimes help people see the follies in what they're thinking. And maybe this is demanding we do that in more creative ways.
And another challenge I believe we need to address is, for example, one of my clients happens that there is a distribution center that never stopped to work 24 hours during all the pandemic because it's a pharmacy chain that had a lot of work during all this time. However, the people within the offices. The administrative people, of course, they were working from home, so the experience was very different. So we cannot address as communicators thinking that everybody lived the same experience. So if we want that everybody is aligned with the culture, we need to be aware that the situation, the experience that the same employees within a company live was very different. So the narrative, the dialogue is very different from the employer. We need to address the expectations, the main priority that was wellness, and that the experience was very different from one sector of the company to another sector. So we need to be aware of that.
Let's talk for a minute about changing culture. If we determine that there are unhealthy elements of the culture and we need to change it, how important is recognition? I have always subscribed to the idea that the only way that you can change employee behavior is through reward and recognition. And we as communicators have little impact on the reward side of things, but a tremendous impact potentially on recognizing the behaviors that we are trying to encourage among people. If we say this person is worthy of recognition because they have behaved in a way that is consistent with the culture that we are trying to build, other people go, oh, that's what it takes to get recognized around here, huh? So is it on us to actually engage in recognition through articles and other ways to spotlight people and to encourage other departments to engage in recognition in order to affect the culture?
I believe we have a big role in that. And we have to change our mindset from that old recognition programs that only recognize once a year the employees that did something well or not. I believe that in this time, in the current time, people, in order to promote and increase engagement, people is really anxious to be recognized on a daily basis on different activities that they do, on their results they have, and being recognized from their own boss and from other leaders, from their other colleagues. So that's one of the main elements that is needed in order to increase engagement, as well as for them to know what is expected from them at work. The purpose of the organization makes them feel that their job is important. All that is quite important, and we need to work with human resources and with leaders in order to foster that. That recognition is quite key now, especially now in these pandemic times that we have been living.
Absolutely. And one of the things that we tried to do, again, back to being in the moment, was we learned from our research kind of how people defined the experience. Again, we were careful not to use the word culture. And so much of the experience day to day was created by how I managed. And so we knew that our 1,400 managers were absolutely critical to this being in the moment and recognizing people in the moment, just Lety, as you described. And so the part two of our little culture club was every week doing a podcast for our 1,400 managers about this is what is working this week, and this is what is working in different parts of the world, and this is how you can this week, starting like in 5 minutes, how you can make this a better place for your people to do their best work, and really empowering the managers to create little mini cultures that add up to a healthy big culture, realizing that it isn't always something that mass media can create, or it can certainly reinforce, but it really happens on the ground, and we can help with that.
And I'd like to question the assumption that we don't get to influence the actual reward process. I think that it's incumbent upon us to engage with human resources if we're not part of that organization, or if we're outside consulting with communications, encourage human resources to come into the conversation so that the reward systems reinforce the culture as much as a recognition does. I worked on a project with a company where one of the big challenges was that the behavior that was being rewarded in bonuses was encouraging behaviors that were not appropriate for the culture.
Right.
And so, bullying bosses and things like that were getting rewarded. And we worked through human resources and the leadership, because human resources can't do it alone either. Everybody got together and realized that if the culture was going to improve, the reward system had to reflect the desired behaviors. And it changed, and everybody looking back was like, oh, wow, we certainly benefited by doing that.
Yeah, processes send messages, right? Whether it's the rewards process or some other process. Jim Schaefer talks a lot about doing process audits to see whether they are consistent with the goals of the organization and the messages that we're trying to send. Over at Engage for Success, which is the UK organization designed to help businesses raise the levels of employee engagement, they have 4 pillars or cornerstones of engagement. One of them they call organizational integrity, which is defined by the say-do gap. This is what we say we do, and yet our processes send a different message. And I agree, Alice. I think reward is definitely one of those that we can talk about. What are others? Where can we look at processes that are standing in the way of culture?
Well, I think. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No.
Well, I was just going to say, I think that the first cousin to the reward process is the performance management process. And I think anytime I've been asked to the question, how healthy is our culture, I say, how healthy is your performance management process? Because usually if there's sickness there's sickness everywhere. And it comes back to, what do we tolerate? And in every performance management process, which leads to how I'm rewarded, there's a balance between what I accomplish and how I accomplish it. And this is where someone has to be the conscience, and someone has to articulate the risks of sending messages that are counter to the culture we say we want to be. And I think that role we play, Alice, you've just identified something absolutely essential.
It's about the proportion, I think, and to look at culture of all the things that we tolerate, to me, reflects on that disconnect between what we say and what we do, and what we accept and what we will turn a blind eye to, if you will. Because if someone is rewarded for behavior that's not something that we support in other practices or policies, it becomes very difficult then to make changes. If someone is rewarded for working long hours, for not taking time off for their vacation or what have you, because it's seen as commitment and diligence to their job, what does it say to people who do their jobs well, but work the time that they have been assigned, and then, have a work-life balance? So to me, part of the work that we have to do around recognition and reward is, what are the things that we are noticing, and what's proportionate around how we notice those things. And so if the rewards, I worked with a group where there was a huge transformation in terms of how work was structured, how the teams were built, where they were located, how those sites were set up. And we proposed in communications that we provide all staff with something that would sum up that whole experience in a positive way. And I remember one of the VPs said to me, well, a really nice keychain will be great. Mm-hmm. And I said, it would actually be better to give nothing. And they were really kind of shocked. And I said, because it was not proportionate to what had just happened. And I said, well, I've actually talked to staff and made some inquiries and listened at conversations in the lunchroom. And I think actually what people would really like is a travel cup, because we're going from place to place. We're moving people around, we're moving work around. And people actually thought this was a really good way to recognize this change in how we were working. And so we persuaded them to go in that direction. But it was always, to me, something that I took away of noticing what people were saying and doing, and what was the reaction or solution proposed in response.
I love that.
There are things that can blow a culture up in a heartbeat. Just everything's cranking along just fine, and then there is an event. I'm thinking in the recent news, there was the CEO who laid off 900 people on Zoom, which clearly had an impact across the rest of the organization, never mind the 900 people who had a holiday gift of losing their job. What can a communications function do to help an organization course correct when something like that happens?
That's a coaching role.
Yeah,
That's definitely a coaching role. And the coaching has got to be, how do you apologize? How do you try to make it right? And how do you move forward? And it's classic crisis communication, but it also requires going back and looking at the root causes, and it's just like if there was a safety incident, figure out how did that happen and how do we prevent it from happening again.
Yeah, one of the dimensions of that story that people haven't been talking about as much as others is the fact that all of the communicators in that company resigned after that happened.
Yay.
So.
Now, and if you were close to the CEO, or you knew what was going to happen, or that could happen, I believe then is when the role of the communicator is quite fundamental in order to coach him, as Alice said, to anticipate and to coach him on how to do things and how to communicate this thing if this had to be done, and not after the thing happened. So the best here is that the communicator should know in advance and should be involved in what's happening in order to develop a communication strategy to do this.
And I think that it comes back to how we, in many cases, try to help organizations prevent self-inflicted injuries. And I think it's a matter of our always asking ourselves, what if, and having a plan to protect the culture from the what ifs, the same way we protect people and we protect facilities and we protect the investment and all of these things. But it's just being able to hopefully then develop the relationship where you can walk in and say, no, you can't do that. No.
Well, we have about 2 minutes left, which is enough time to let everybody know what's coming up next month on Circle of Fellows. This will be on Thursday, January 20th at noon Eastern. Episode 77 will focus on how to manage communication for results and value. Just a little topic. It's an inch deep. Sure, we'll find some questions to address on that panel. The members of that panel will include Priya Bates. Stephanie Griffiths is joining us, one of the 2021 class of fellows, and joining us from South Africa, Cindy Schmieg and Jim Schaefer, who I think would have had fun on today's panel talking about operationalizing communication as a way of addressing the culture. Want to thank all of you for your participation today. I think it's been a great discussion, and look forward to seeing people in the audience again on the panel on the 20th. So until then, thanks everybody for a great discussion. See you soon. I hope to see you all in New York too for the IABC conference in June.
Yes.
Thank you.
All the
Shel.
best in 2022.
Yes. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Happy
Thank you.
holidays.
Happy New Year,
and
everybody.
good New
Best
Year.
wishes for everybody.
Thank
Bye.
you. You too.